Hello teachers, welcome and thank you for tuning in. We are so excited to present to you the Teacher Sensory Toolbox. This first video is going to be covering sensory processing.
Okay, so we're just going to give a little bit of background about occupational therapy in the school setting. So first, what is occupational therapy? So occupational therapists work with students to increase their participation in activities that they need to do, want to do, and are expected to do. So this includes participating in the educational setting, which is an occupation for them. So that means they are expected to participate in different classroom activities, lunch, recess, and all other activities throughout their day. Okay, so why occupational therapy? Occupational therapists are equipped to assess the impact of students' abilities and their classroom environment on their engagement in educational occupations. So as a result, OTs can provide recommendations for classroom management and setting up the environment that ultimately sets up you as educators for success. And that is exactly what we're planning to do with you guys at St. Francis.
So as far as interventions go, there's 3 different types. The first tier is going to be school-wide intervention. So that's going to be a general, broad intervention for the entire school. So for you guys, that's like your sensory lab. It covers your bases for everybody. The second tier is going to be directly supporting the teachers, which is you guys. So that involves the OTs coming in and supporting you so that you can support the students. So that's what we're here doing today. This third tier here is going to be directly pulling the students out of the classroom, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So right now, I know it's tough if the students are in the class. You need to pull them out so that they can either go to the sensory lab or get one-on-one support with a teacher or a para, but we don't want that. We want to help the kids be in the classroom as much as possible, so we're going to be really focusing in on this Tier 2 intervention.
Okay, so here's today's outline for today's video. We are going to cover the different types of interventions, touch on emotional regulation, discuss the pyramid of learning and the different patterns of sensory processing, and then the second video will touch more on St. Francis specifically and different recommendations for your classrooms. Okay, so now we're going to discuss a few definitions that are related to regulation. And so we're going to start with self-regulation, and this refers to an individual's ability to control their own emotions and use different strategies to manage those behaviors when they're frustrated or experiencing negative emotions. So these strategies can include things like taking deep breaths or distancing themselves from situations that are causing them stress.
So for co-regulation, this is going to be where an adult is actually helping them regulate. So they're no longer doing it on their own. They have an adult or a teacher like you. They're helping them model good emotional regulation or guiding them through different activities such as the deep breaths or modifying their environment.
So upregulation involves increasing the overall arousal in response to different sensory experiences. So students who are upregulating might be more high energy or have heightened reactions to activities. So activities that are appropriate for these students are things like dancing and eating sour candy, which are both upregulating.
So then on the flip side of that, down-regulation is going to be decreasing their overall arousal. So they might be low energy or have decreased reactivity. So some down-regulating things would be like the deep breathing and listening to calming music.
The next term is dysregulation, which you may be a little more familiar with. So if a student is having difficulty engaging with their peers or in different classroom activities, this means that they have an imbalance in their sensory systems and a child's sensory needs are not being met. So this is where we'll step in to provide the appropriate either down or up regulating intervention to meet those needs. And we're going to further discuss those needs throughout the pyramid of learning. This is the pyramid of learning, which is essentially an illustration that represents the foundational skills that support academic learning. And those foundational skills are represented at the base of the pyramid, and each skill above is supported by those below. So as those lower tiers develop, the more effectively a child will be able to attain the higher level skills that support their learning. So the bottom tier starts with the CNS, which includes the brain and spinal cord, which are both responsible for communicating different things to various parts of the body. And it does this by sending electrical signals throughout the body that allows us to respond to different sensory stimuli. So if those receptors in the brain and spinal cord are impaired, a child may not know how to respond to certain stimuli in their environment, which then impairs their ability to appropriately respond to the input they're receiving in their sensory systems.
Now, the second tier is where the money's at. So this is the sensory systems. This is where we're going to be honing in on. So as you can see, this is a foundational skill that the kids need to have regulated before they can achieve that higher level learning. If this is not regulated, they're not learning from you. So that's why we're going to go into this. In the following slides, we'll be going a little more in detail on what each of these sensory systems involves.
We are just going to briefly touch on the remaining tiers of the pyramid of learning. So starting with the sensory motor tier, this just kind of refers to our ability to combine different sensory information with other motor commands that allow us to produce body movement. Then we have perceptual motor, which is just the body's ability to interpret or perceive different sensory information that comes from the environment to then guide our movement or cause our body to react to that sensory stimuli. And then lastly, we have cognition and intellect, which includes different brain functions that include skills such as problem solving, memory, our ability to plan and organize information, control our emotions, also that we can complete daily activities in school or at home.
So what does that look like in your classroom? So, for example, when it's cold outside, you might tell your kids to get their coats on and get in line. Your kids are able to do that because first they hear your voice with their auditory sensory system. Then they're able to screen out the background noise to identify that your voice is important. Then they can use their motor planning in order to plan how they're going to move in response to the directions that they heard. And then they can react appropriately and follow a multi-step direction. So, for example, get your coats and get in line, that's 2 different directions all in one step. So they're able to follow that because they can use a multi-step instruction. So you can see how starting at the bottom with just the sensory system of hearing your voice, they work all the way up to the top layer of this pyramid in order to follow your directions.
As we discussed, we're going to go a little more in depth on the sensory systems. So starting with visual perception, this is how we interpret our environment through our vision. So we use this to recognize different shapes, sizes, directions, and distinguish objects from their background. So for example, when you're reading a book, you rely on your visual perception to see the words on that page and interpret the information that it then allows you to read. Next up is our auditory sense. So this refers to our sense of hearing that allows us to process and distinguish different sounds in our environment. So for example, when you're listening to music in class and you call out or give a direction to a student, they're then able to differentiate between your voice and that music and then tune out that music to follow your instructions they have been given. Then we have tactile, which is our sense of touch, and this includes how we perceive different things like the pressure, temperature, and pain that we may be feeling. So some people may have tactile defensiveness, which means they react more strongly to certain textures or sensation. So for examples, you might have a student who is very sensitive to certain types of clothes, whether that's the tags that are in them or the different textures of the material, or you might have a child who may not be tolerant to just being touched by others in general. And then we have gustatory, which is our sense of taste, and this helps us discern between different flavors such as sweet, salty, sour, and bitter.
You smell that? Up next is olfactory. So this is your sense of smell. So for example, when your student walks into the lunchroom, they're going to smell all the different foods around them. Then we have vestibular. So this is your body's ability to detect that it is in motion. So you have these little crystals in your inner ear that detect if you're spinning, swinging, whatever. So if your kid is on a swing on the playground, the vestibular system is what allows them to know that their body is moving. Up next is proprioception. So this is your body's ability to detect where it is in space without being able to see it. So for example, when you close your eyes, you're still able to touch your nose with your fingertip because of proprioception. And lastly, we have interoception. So this is your body's awareness of its internal state. So for example, are you hungry? Are you thirsty? What are your energy levels like today? That's your body's interoception.
Touch on the different patterns of sensory processing. So first is seeking, which is seeking sensory input in the environment, and it is more of an active response to sensory stimuli. So for example, a student who frequently touches different textures in the classroom, such as feeling the different texture of books, walls, or different fabrics, would be considered more sensory seeking. The next pattern is avoiding, which is when an individual tends to avoid certain sensory inputs by showing a preference to specific stimuli, but then a strong avoidance of others. So for example, you may have a student who, when a classroom or the environment they're in gets too loud for them, they may try to remove themselves or run out of the classroom to completely avoid that noise.
The third type is going to be sensitivity. So these kiddos have a heightened awareness of sensory input. So things that may not seem like a big deal to you are a really big deal to them. So for example, if they're in the classroom and the fluorescent lights are really bright overhead, they might tell you that the lights are hurting their eyes. The last sensory processing type is registration. So these are the kiddos who may just totally miss sensory input in their environment. So for example, you might be calling their name and they might totally miss what you're saying, or you give instructions, they don't hear it. They might hang out in kind of the back of the class. You might notice things like that. So in the following slides, we're going to go more in depth on each of these subtypes.
A student who is sensory seeking may need more sensory input from their environment, and they may seem more interested in exploring the classroom or environment around them. So they may seem like they need to touch everything, or they frequently make sounds with their mouth or other objects that they have in front of them. And you may notice that these students become more easily bored during classroom activities. So for example, when we were observing, we noticed the kids were wearing little Valentine's headbands and would shake their heads, and this is an example of them seeking that sensory input. The next pattern is avoiding. When a child is sensory avoiding, this means that they are overwhelmed by the environment and will move away from sensory stimuli. So you might notice a child is not willing to participate or attempts to remove themselves from an environment because there's something in there that is overwhelming to them, such as certain sounds, different textures, foods, or activities.
Let's talk a little bit more about the third processing type, which is sensitivity. So these kiddos might be very distractible and they're going to be really uncomfortable with really loud, intense stimuli. So really bright lights, really loud noises, things like that. They tend to notice overly all the sensory input in their environment. So for example, like I said, the lights might hurt their eyes, but also with really loud noises, they might cover their ears and try to block it out. So one thing about these kids that is a good thing is they're going to be really good at paying attention to the details. Lastly, here's a little more about registration, which is the fourth pattern of sensory processing. So these are the kiddos who really under-respond to the sensory input in their environment. So like I said, they might be missing your instructions. If you call their name, they might not notice. They have really a hard time responding to really rapidly presented sensory input, so they might respond just a little bit slower because it's going to take them longer to notice. One advantage of this, though, is they might find it easier to focus in a really distracting environment because really a lot of that chaos is not getting through. So that's one good thing.
Do a little matching activity to think through the different patterns of sensory processing. So as we read these, take a second to think about what pattern you think the student might be exhibiting. So first, you have a student who is putting everything in their mouth and seems to be constantly moving.
That's sensory seeking. Next, you have a student who has a hard time paying attention in class when there are bright lights or loud noises.
That would be sensitivity. So next you have a student who covers their ears when the environment is really loud and they hate when their hands are messy.
That's avoiding. Next, your student seems to be low energy. They bump into things in the classroom and they don't notice when their hands are dirty.
And finally, that would be low registration.
All right, guys, that's the end of video 1. Thanks for hanging with us. In video 2, we're going to be talking about sensory strategies for your guys' classroom.